Happy Friday. Welcome. Hope you're doing great today. I'm going to be reading a bit. Hope I can get the volume to sound correctly whenever I'm just talking. read some from chapter 5, and then maybe more. If you like hearing and discussing yoga and philosophy, follow me on Twitch or subscribe on YouTube. Appreciate it. All right. Chapter 5, The Laboratory of the Body. This little book is not intended for a textbook upon physiology, but inasmuch as the majority of people seem to have little or no idea of the nature, functions, and uses of the various bodily organs, we think it as well to say a few words regarding the very important organs of the body which have to do with the digestion and assimilation of the food which nourishes the body, which perform the laboratory work of the system. The first bit of the human machinery of digestion to be considered by us are the teeth. Nature has provided us with teeth to bite our food and grind it into fine bits, thus rendering it of a convenient size and consistency to be easily acted upon by the saliva and the digestive juices of the stomach, after which it is reduced to a liquid form that its nourishing qualities may be easily assimilated and absorbed by the body. This seems to be merely a repetition of an oft-told tale, but how many of our readers really act as if they knew what purpose their teeth had been given them? They bolt their food just as if teeth were merely a show, and generally act as if nature had provided them with a gizzard, by the aid of which they could, like the fowl, grind up and break into small bits the food that they had bolted. Remember, friends, that your teeth were given you a purpose, and also consider the fact that if nature had intended you to bolt your food, she would have provided you with a gizzard instead of with teeth. We will have much to say about the proper use of the teeth as we go along, as it has a very close connection with the vital principle of Hatha Yoga, as you will see after a while. The next organs to be considered are the salivary glands. These glands are 6 in number, of which 4 are located under the tongue and jaw, and 2 in the cheeks in the front of the ears, 1 on each side. Their best known function is to manufacture, generate, or secrete saliva, which, when needed, flows out through numerous ducts in different parts of the mouth and mixes with the food which is being chewed or masticated. The food being chewed into smaller particles, the saliva is able to more thoroughly reach all portions of it with a correspondingly increased effect. The saliva moistens the food, thus allowing it to be more easily swallowed. This function, however, being a mere incident to its more important ones. Its best known function, and the one which Western science teaches is its most important one, is its chemical offices, which convert the starchy food matter into sugar, thus performing the first step in the process of digestion. Here is another oft-told tale. You all know about the saliva, but how many of you eat in a manner which allows nature to put the saliva to work as she had designed? You bolt your food after a few perfunctory chews and defeat nature's plans, toward which she has gone to as much trouble and to perform which she has built such beautiful and delicate machinery. But nature manages to get back at you for your contempt and disregard of her plans. Nature has a good memory and always makes you pay your debts. We must not forget to mention the tongue, that faithful friend who is so often made to perform the ignoble task of assisting in utterance of angry words, retailing of gossip, lying, nagging, swearing, and last but not least, complaining. The tongue has a most important work to perform in the process of nourishing the body with food. Besides a number of mechanical movements which it performs in eating, in which it helps to move the food along in its similar service in the act of swallowing. It is the organ of taste and passes critical judgment upon the food, which asks admittance to the stomach. You have neglected the normal uses of the teeth, the salivary glands, and the tongue, and they have consequently failed to give you the best service. If you but trust them and return to sane and normal methods of eating, you will find them gladly and cheerfully responding to your trust and will once more give you their full share of service. They are good friends and servants, but need a little confidence, trust, and responsibility to bring out their best points. After the food has been chewed or masticated and then saturated with saliva, it passes down the throat into the stomach. The lower part of the throat, which is called the gullet, performs a peculiar muscular contraction which pushes downward the particles of food, which act forms a part of the process of swallowing. The process of converting the starchy portion of the food into sugar or glucose, which is begun by the saliva in the mouth, is continued as the food passes into the down the gullet, but nearly or entirely ceases when the food once reaches the stomach, which fact must be considered when one studies the subject of the advantage of a deliberate habit of eating, as if the food is hastily chewed and swallowed, it reaches the stomach only partially affected by the saliva, and in an imperfect condition for nature's subsequent work. The stomach itself is a pear-shaped bag with a capacity of about 1 quart, or more in some cases. The food enters the stomach from the gullet on the upper left-hand side, just below the heart. The food afterwards leaves the stomach on the lower right hand and enters the small intestine by means of a peculiar sort of valve, which is so wonderfully constructed that it allows the matter from the stomach to pass easily through it, but refuses to allow anything to work back from the intestine into the stomach. This valve is known as the pyloric valve, or the pyloric orifice. The word pyloric being derived from the Greek word which means gatekeeper. And indeed, this little valve acts as a more intelligent gatekeeper, always on the watch, never asleep. The stomach is a great chemical laboratory in which the food undergoes chemical changes which allow it to be taken up by the system and changed into a nourishing material, which is converted into a rich red blood which courses all over the body, building up, repairing, strengthening, and adding to all the parts of the organs. The inside of the stomach is covered with a lining of delicate mucous membrane, which is filled with minute glands, all of which open into the stomach and around, which is a very fine network of minute blood vessels with remarkably thin walls, from which is manufactured or secreted that wonderful fluid, the gastric juice. The gastric juice is a powerful liquid acting as a solvent upon what is called the nitrogenous portions of the food. It also acts upon the sugar or glucose, which has been manufactured from the starchy food by the saliva, as above described. It is a bitter sort of liquid, containing a chemical product called pepsin, which is its active agent, and which plays a most important part in the digestion of food. In a normal, healthy person, the stomach manufactures or secretes about 1 gallon of gastric juice in 24 hours and uses same in the process of digestion of the food. When the food reaches the stomach, the little glands before mentioned pour out a sufficient supply of the gastric juice, which mixes up with the mass of food in the stomach. Then the stomach sets up sort of a churning motion, which moves the pulpy food round and round from end to end, from side to side, twisting and turning it, churning and kneading it, until the gastric juice penetrates every part of the mass and is well mixed up into it. The instinctive mind does some wonderful work in the stomach movements and works like a well-oiled machine. And if the stomach has been treated to properly prepared, well-chewed food, properly insalivated, the machine is able to turn out a fine job. But if, as so often happens, the food is of quality not fit for the human stomach, or if it has been half chewed or bolted, or if the stomach has been stuffed by a gluttonous owner, there's going to be trouble. In such a case, instead of the normal process of digestion being performed, the stomach is unable to do its work and fermentation results, and the stomach becomes the holder of a fermenting, putrefying, rotting mass, an yeast pot, it has been called under such circumstances. If people could but form an idea of what a cesspool they maintain in their stomachs, they would cease to shrug their shoulders and look bored whenever the subject of rational and sane habits of eating are mentioned. This putrefying ferment, arising from abnormal habits of eating, often becomes chronic and results in a condition which manifests itself in the symptoms of what is called dyspepsia or similar troubles. It remains in the stomach for a long time after the meal, and then when the next meal reaches the stomach, the fermentation continues until the stomach actually becomes a perpetually active yeast pot. This condition, of course, results in an impairment of the normal functioning of the stomach, the surface of which becomes slimy, soft, thin, and weak. The glands become clogged, and the whole digestive apparatus of the stomach becomes impaired and broken down. In such event, the half-digested food passes out into the small intestine, tainted with the acids arising from fermentation, and the result is that the whole system becomes gradually poisoned and imperfectly nourished. The food mass saturated with the gastric juice which has been poured upon it and kneaded and churned into it leaves the stomach by the pyloric orifice on the lower right-hand side of the stomach and enters the small intestine. The small intestine is a tube-like canal ingeniously coiled upon itself so as to occupy but a comparatively small space, but which is really from 20 to 30 feet in length. Its inner walls are lined with a velvety substance, and through the greater part of its length, this velvety lining is arranged in transverse, shelf-like folds, which maintain a sort of winking motion, swaying backward and forward in the intestinal fluids, retarding the passage of the food and providing an increased surface for secretion and absorption. The velvety condition of this mucous lining is caused by numerous minute elevations, something like the surface of a piece of plush, which are known as the intestinal villi, the office of which will be explained a little further on. As soon as the food mass enters the small intestine, it is met with a peculiar fluid called the bile, which saturates it and is thoroughly mixed up with it. The bile is a secretion of the liver and is stored up ready for use in a strong bag known as the gallbladder. About 2 quarts of bile per day is used in saturating the food as it passes into the small intestine. Its purpose is to assist the pancreatic juice in preparing the fatty parts of the food for absorption and also to aid in the prevention of decomposition and putrefaction of the food as it passes through the small intestine and the neutralization of the gastric juice, which has already performed its work. The pancreatic juice is secreted by the pancreas, an elongated organ situated just behind the stomach, and its purpose is to act upon the fatty portions of the food and to render them possible of absorption from the intestines along with the other parts of the food nourishment. About 1 1/2 pints is used daily in this work. The hundreds of thousands of plush-like hairs upon the velvety lining of the small intestine above alluded to, and which are known as villi, maintain a constant waving motion, passing through and in the soft, semi-liquid food which is passing through the small intestine. They are constantly in motion, licking up and absorbing the nourishment that is contained in the food mass and transmitting it to the system. The several steps whereby the food is converted into blood and is carried to all parts of the system are as follows: mastication, insalivation, deglutition, stomach and intestinal digestion, absorption, circulation, and assimilation. Let us run over them again hastily that we may not forget them. Mastication is performed by the teeth. It is the chewing process, the lips, tongue, and cheeks assisting in the work. It breaks up the food into small particles and enables the saliva to reach it more thoroughly. Insalivation is the process of saturating the masticated food with the saliva which pours into it from the salivary glands. The saliva acts upon the cooked starch in the food, changing it into dextrine and then into glucose, thus rendering it soluble. This chemical change is rendered possible by the action of the ptyalin in the saliva, acting as a ferment and changing the chemical constitution of those substances for which it has an affinity. Digestion is performed in the stomach and small intestines and consists in the conversion of the food mass into products capable of being absorbed and assimilated. Digestion begins when the food reaches the stomach. The gastric juice then pours out copiously and, becoming mixed up with and churned into the food mass, it dissolves the connective tissue of meat, releases fat from its envelopes by breaking them up, and transforms some of the albuminous material, such as lean meat, the gluten of wheat and white of eggs, into albuminose, in which form they are capable of being absorbed and assimilated. The transformation occasioned by stomach digestion is accompanied by the chemical action of an organic ingredient of the gastric juice, called pepsin, in connection with the acid ingredients of the gastric juice. While the process of digestion is being performed by the stomach, the fluid portion of the food mass, both that which has entered the stomach as fluids, which have been drunken, as well as the fluids liberated from the solid food in the process of digestion, is rapidly taken up by the absorbents in the stomach and is carried to the blood, while the more solid portions of the food mass are churned up by the muscular action of the stomach, as we have stated. In about a half hour, the solid portions of the food mass begin slowly to leave the stomach in the form of a grayish, pasty substance called chyme, which is a mixture of some of the sugar and salts of the food, of transformed starch or glucose, of softened starch, of broken fat and connective tissue, and of albuminose. The chyme, leaving the stomach, enters the small intestine, as we have described, and comes in contact with the pancreatic and intestinal juices, and with the bile, and intestinal digestion ensues. These fluids dissolve most of the food that has not already been softened. Intestinal digestion resolves the chyme into three substances known as peptone from the digestion of albuminous particles, chyle from the emulsion of the fats, and glucose from the transformation of the starchy elements of the food. These substances are, to a large extent, carried into the blood and become a part of it, while the undigested food passes out of the small intestine through a trapdoor-like valve into the large bowel called the colon, of which we shall speak by and by. Absorption, by which name is known the process by which the above-named products of the food resulting from that digestive process are taken up by the veins and lacteals, is affected by endosmosis. The water and the fluids liberated from the food mass by the stomach digestion are rapidly absorbed and carried away by the blood in the portal vein to the liver. The peptone and glucose from the small intestines also reaches the portal vein to the liver through the blood vessels of the intestinal villi, which we have described. This blood reaches the heart after passing through the liver, where it undergoes a process which we will speak of when we reach the subject of the liver. The chyle, which is the remaining product of the food mass in the intestines after the peptone and glucose have been taken up and carried to the liver, is taken up and passes through the lacteals into the thoracic duct and is gradually conveyed to the blood, as will be further described in our chapter on the circulation. In our chapter on the circulation, we will explain how the blood carries the nutriment derived from the digested food to all parts of the body, giving to each tissue, cell, organ, and part the material by which it builds up and repairs itself, thus enabling the body to grow and develop. The liver secretes the bile, which is carried to the small intestine, as we have stated. It also stores up a substance called glycogen, which is formed in the liver from the digested materials brought to it by the portal vein. Glycogen is stored up in the liver and is afterwards gradually transformed in the intervals of digestion into glucose, or a substance similar to grape sugar. The pancreas secretes the pancreatic juices, which it pours into the small intestine to aid in intestinal digestion, where it acts chiefly upon the fatty portions of the food. The kidneys are located in the loins, behind the intestines. They are 2 in number and are shaped like beans. They purify the blood by removing from it a poisonous substance called urea and other waste products. The fluid secreted by the kidneys is carried by 2 tubes called ureters to the bladder. The bladder is located in the pelvis and serves as a reservoir for the urine, which consists of waste fluids carrying with it refuse matter of the system. Before leaving this part of the subject, we wish to call the attention of our readers to the fact that when the food enters the stomach and small intestines improperly masticated and insalivated, when the teeth and salivary glands have not been given a chance to do their work properly, digestion is interfered with and impeded, and the digestive organs are overworked and rendered unable to accomplish what is asked of them. It is like asking one set of workmen to do their own work in addition to the work which should have been previously performed by another set of men. It is asking the railroad engineer to perform the duties of firemen as well as his own, to keep the fire going on an upgrade and run the locomotive on a dangerous bit of road at the same time. The absorbents of the stomach and intestines must absorb something. That is their business. And if you do not give them the proper materials, they will absorb the fermenting and putrefying mass in the stomach and pass it along to the blood. The blood carries this poor material to all parts of the body, including the brain, and it is no wonder that people complain of biliousness, headaches, etc., when they are being self-poisoned in this way. Chapter 6, the life fluid. In the last chapter, we gave you an idea of how the food we eat is gradually transformed and resolved into substances capable of being absorbed and taken up by the blood, which carries the nourishment to all parts of the system, where it is used in building up, repairing, and renewing the several parts of the physical man. In this chapter, we will give you a brief description of how this work of the blood is carried on. The nutritive portions of the digested food is taken up by the circulation and becomes blood. The blood flows through the arteries to every cell and tissue of the body, that it may perform its constructive and recuperative work. It then returns through the arteries, carrying with it the broken down cells and other waste matter of the system, that the waste may be expelled from the system by the lungs and other organs performing the casting out work of the system. This flow of the blood to and from the heart is called the circulation. The engine which drives this wonderful system of physical machinery is, of course, the heart. We will not take up your time describing the heart, but will instead tell you something of the work performed by it. Let us begin at the point at which we left off in our last chapter, the point at which the nourishment of the food taken up by the blood which assimilates it reaches the heart, which sends it out on its errand of nourishing the body. The blood starts on its journey through the arteries, which are a series of elastic canals, having divisions and subdivisions, beginning with the main canals, which feed the smaller ones, which in turn feed still smaller ones, until the capillaries are reached. The capillaries are very small blood vessels measuring about 1/3000th of an inch in diameter. They resemble very fine hairs, which resemblance gives them their name. The capillaries penetrate the tissues in meshes of network, bringing the blood in close contact with all the parts. Their walls are very thin, and the nutritious ingredients of the blood exude through their walls and are taken up by the tissues. The capillaries not only exude the nourishment from the blood, but they also take up the blood on its return journey, as we will see presently, and generally fetch and carry for the system, including the absorption of the nourishment of the food from the intestinal villi, as described in the last chapter. Well, to get back to the arteries, they carry the rich, red, pure blood from the heart, laden with health-giving nutrition and life, distributing it through large canal into smaller, from smaller into still smaller, until finally the tiny hair-like capillaries are reached and the tissues take up the nourishment and use it for building purposes. The wonderful little cells of the body doing this work most intelligently. We shall have something to say regarding the work of these cells by and by. The blood, having given up a supply of nourishment, begins its return journey to heart, taking with it the waste products, dead cells, broken down tissue, and other refuse of the system. It starts with the capillaries, but this return journey is not made through the arteries, but by a switch-off arrangement. It is directed into the smaller veinlets of the venous system, or system of veins, from whence it passes to the larger veins and on to the heart. Before it reaches the arteries again on a new trip, however, something happens to it. It goes to the crematory of the lungs in order to have its waste matter and impurities burnt up and cast off. In another chapter, we will tell you about this work of the lungs. Before passing on, however, we must tell you that there exists another fluid which circulates through the system. This is called the lymph, which closely resembles the blood in composition. It contains some of the ingredients of the blood which have exuded from the walls of the blood vessels and some of the waste products of the system, which, after being cleansed and made over by the lymphatic system, re-enter the blood and are again used. The lymph circulate in thin vein-like canals, so small that they cannot be readily seen by the human eye, until they are injected with quicksilver. These canals empty into several of the large veins, and the lymph then mingles with the returning blood on its way to the heart. The chyle, after leaving the small intestine, see last chapter, mingles with the lymph from the lower parts of the body and gets into the blood in this way, while the other products of the digested food pass through the portal vein and the liver on their journey, so that although they take different routes, they meet again in the circulating blood. So, you will see, the blood is the constituent of the body, which directly or indirectly furnishes nourishment and life to all the parts of the body. If the blood is poor or the circulation weak, nutrition of some parts of the body must be impaired, and diseased conditions will result. The blood supplies about 1/10 of man's weight. Of this amount, about 1/4 is distributed to the heart, lungs, large arteries, and veins, about 1/4 in the liver, about 1/4 in the muscles, the remaining quarter being distributed among the remaining organs and tissues. The brain utilizes about 1/5 of the entire quantity of blood. Remember, always, in thinking about the blood, that the blood is what you make it by the food you eat and the way you eat it. You can have the very best kind of blood, and plenty of it, by selecting the proper foods, and by eating such food as nature intended you to do. Or, on the other hand, you may have very poor blood, and an insufficient quantity of it, by foolish gratification of the abnormal appetite, and by improper eating, not worthy of the name, of any kind of food. The blood is the life, and you make the blood, that is, the matter in a nutshell. Now, let us pass on to the crematory of the lungs and see what is going to happen to that blue, impure venous blood, which has come back from all parts of the body, laden with impurities and waste matter. Let us have a look at the crematory. Chapter 7. The crematory of the system. The organs of respiration consist of the lungs and the air passages leading to them. The lungs are 2 in number and occupy the pleural chamber of the thorax, one on one side, one on each side of the median line, being separated from each other by the heart, the greater blood vessels and the larger air tubes. Each lung is free in all directions except at the root, which consists chiefly of the bronchi, arteries, and veins, connecting the lungs with the trachea and heart. The lungs are spongy and porous, and their tissues are very elastic. They are covered with a delicately constructed but strong sac known as the pleural sac, one wall of which closely adheres to the lung, and the other to the inner wall of the chest, and which secretes a fluid which allows the inner surfaces of the walls to glide easily upon each other in the act of breathing. The air passages consist of the interior of the nose, pharynx, larynx, windpipe or trachea, and in the bronchial tubes. When we breathe, we draw in the air through the nose, in which it is warmed by contact with the mucous membrane, which is richly supplied with blood, and after it has passed through the pharynx and larynx, it passes into the trachea or windpipe, which subdivides into numerous tubes called the bronchial tubes, which in turn subdivide into and terminate in minute subdivisions in all the small air spaces in the lungs, of which the lungs contain millions. A writer has stated that if the air cells of the lungs were spread out over an unbroken surface, they would cover an area of 14,000 square feet. The air is drawn into the lungs by the action of the diaphragm, a great, strong, flat, sheet-like muscle stretched across the chest, separating the chest box from the abdomen. The diaphragm's action is almost as automatic as that of the heart, although it may be transformed into a semi-voluntary muscle by an effort of the will. When it expands, it increases the size of the chest and lungs, and the air rushes into the vacuum thus created. When it relaxes, the chest and lungs contract, and the air is expelled from the lungs. Now, before considering what happens to the air in the lungs, let us look a little into the matter of the circulation of the blood. The blood, as you know, is driven by the heart through the arteries into the capillaries, thus reaching every part of the body, which it vitalizes, nourishes, and strengthens. It then returns by means of the capillaries by another route, the veins, to the heart, from whence it is drawn to the lungs. The blood starts on its arterial journey, bright red and rich, laden with life-giving qualities and properties. It returns by the venous route, poor, blue, and dull, being laden down with the waste matter of the system. It goes out like a fresh stream from the mountains. It returns as a stream of sewer water. This foul stream goes to the right auricle of the heart. When this auricle becomes filled, it contracts and forces the stream of blood through an opening in the right ventricle of the heart, which in turn sends it on to the lungs, where it is distributed by millions of hair-like blood vessels to the air cells of the lungs, of which we have spoken. Now let us take up the story of the lungs at this point. The foul stream of blood is now distributed among the millions of tiny air cells in the lungs. A breath of air is inhaled, and the oxygen of the air comes in contact with the impure blood through the thin walls of the hair-like blood vessels of the lungs, which walls are thick enough to hold the blood, but thin enough to admit the oxygen to penetrate them. When the oxygen comes in contact with the blood, a form of combustion takes place, and the blood takes up oxygen and releases carbonic acid gas generated from the waste products and poisonous matter which has been gathered up by the blood from all parts of the system. The blood thus purified and oxygenated is carried back to the heart, again rich, red and bright, and laden with life-giving properties and qualities. Upon reaching the left auricle of the heart, it is forced into the left ventricle, from whence it is again forced out through the arteries on its mission of life to all parts of the system. It is estimated that in a single day of 24 hours, 35,000 pints of blood traverse the capillaries of the lungs. The blood corpuscles passing in single file and being exposed to the oxygen of the air on both of their surfaces. When one considers the minute details of the process alluded to, he is lost in wonder and admiration of nature's infinite care and intelligence. It will be seen that unless fresh air in sufficient quantities reaches the lungs, the foul stream of venous blood cannot be purified, and consequently, not only is the body thus robbed of nourishment, but the waste products which should have been destroyed are returned to the circulation and poison the system, and death ensues. Impure air acts in the same way, only in a lessened degree. It will also be seen that if one does not breathe in a sufficient quantity of air, the work of the blood cannot go on properly, and the result is that the body is insufficiently nourished and disease ensues, or a state of imperfect health is experienced. The blood of one who breathes improperly is, of course, of a bluish, dark color, lacking the rich redness of a pure arterial blood. This often shows itself in a poor complexion. Proper breathing and a consequent good circulation results in a clear, bright complexion. A little reflection will show the vital importance of correct breathing. If the blood is not fully purified by the regenerative process of the lungs, it returns to the arteries in an abnormal state, insufficiently purified and imperfectly cleansed of the impurities which it took up on its return journey. These impurities, if returned to the system, will certainly manifest in some form of disease, either in a form of blood disease or some disease resulting from impaired functioning of some insufficiently nourished organ or tissue. The blood which properly exposed to the air in the lungs not only has its impurities consumed and parts with its noxious carbonic acid gas, but it also takes up and absorbs a certain quantity of oxygen, which it carries to all parts of the body, where it is needed in order that nature may perform her processes properly. When the oxygen comes in contact with the blood, it unites with the hemoglobin of the blood and is carried to every cell, tissue, muscle, and organ, which it invigorates and strengthens, replacing the worn-out cells and tissue by new materials which nature converts to her use. Arterial blood, properly exposed to the air, contains about 25% of free oxygen. Not only is every part vitalized by the oxygen, but the act of digestion depends materially upon a certain amount of oxygenation of the food, and this is only accomplished by the oxygen in the blood coming in contact with the food and producing a certain form of combustion. It is therefore necessary that a proper supply of oxygen be taken through the lungs. This accounts for the fact that weak lungs and poor digestion are so often found together. To grasp the full significance of this statement, one must remember that the entire body receives nourishment from the food assimilated, and that imperfect assimilation always means an imperfectly nourished body. Even the lungs themselves depend upon the same source of nourishment, and if through imperfect breathing the assimilation becomes imperfect, and the lungs in turn become weakened, they are rendered still less able to perform their work properly, and so in turn the body becomes further weakened. Every particle of food and drink must be oxygenated before it can yield us the proper nourishment, and before the waste products of the system can be reduced to the proper condition to be eliminated from the system. Lack of sufficient oxygen means imperfect nutrition, imperfect elimination, and imperfect health. Verily, breath is life. The combustion arising from the change in the waste products generates heat and equalizes the temperature of the body. Good breathers are not apt to take cold or get sick, and they generally have plenty of good warm blood which enables them to resist the changes in the outer temperature. In addition to the above-mentioned important processes, the act of breathing gives exercise to the internal organs and muscles, which features are generally overlooked by the Western writers on the subject, but which the yogis fully appreciate. In imperfect or shallow breathing, only a portion of the lungs are brought into play, and a great portion of the lung capacity is lost, the system suffering in proportion to the amount of under-oxygenation. The lower animals, in their native state, breathed naturally, and primitive man undoubtedly did the same. The abnormal manner of living adopted by civilized man, the shadow that follows upon civilization, has robbed us of our natural habit of breathing, and the race has greatly suffered thereby. Man's only physical salvation is to get back to nature. Chapter 8. Nourishment. The human body is constantly undergoing change. Atoms of bone, tissue, flesh, muscle, fat, and fluids are constantly being worn out and removed from the system, and new atoms are constantly being manufactured in the wonderful laboratory of the body, and then sent to take the place of the worn out and discarded material. Let us consider the physical body of man and its mechanism as a plant, and indeed it is akin to the life of the plant in its nature. What does the plant require to bring it up from seed to sprout, from sprout to plant, with flower, seed, and fruit? The answer is simple. Fresh air, sunlight, water, and nourishing soil. These things, and all of them, must it have in order to grow to healthy maturity? And man's physical body requires just the same things, all of them, in order to be healthy, strong, and normal. Remember the requisites: fresh air, sunlight, water, and food. We will consider the matter of air, sunlight, and water in other chapters, and we'll consider the matter of nourishing food first. Just as the plant grows slowly but steadily, so does this great work of discarding worn-out material and the substitution of new material go on constantly, day and night. We are not conscious of this mighty work, as it belongs to that great subconscious part of man's nature. It is a part of the work of the instinctive mind. The whole of the body and all its parts depend on health, strength, and vigor upon this constant renewal of material. If this renewal were stopped, disintegration and death would ensue. The replacing of the worn out and discarded material is an imperative necessity of our organism, and therefore is the first thing to be considered when we think of the healthy man. The keynote of this subject of food in the Hatha Yoga philosophy is the Sanskrit word, the English equivalent of which is nourishment. We print the word in capital letters that it may make an impression upon your minds. We wish our students to associate the thought of food with the thought of nourishment. To the yogi, food does not mean something to tickle the abnormal palate, but instead it means first nourishment, second nourishment, and third nourishment. Nourishment first, last, and always. To many of the Western people, the ideal yogi is a lean, lank, scrawny, half-starved, emaciated being who thinks so little of food that he goes for days without eating, one who considers food to be too material for his spiritual nature. Nothing can be further from the truth. The yogis, at least those who are well grounded in Hatha Yoga, regard nourishment as his first duty toward his body, and he is always careful to keep that body properly nourished, and to see that the supply of new, fresh material is always at least equal to the worn out and discarded matter. It is quite true that the yogi is not a gross eater, nor is he inclined to rich and fancy dishes. On the contrary, he smiles at the folly of such things, and goes to his plain and nourishing meal, knowing that he will obtain there full nourishment, without the waste and harmful matter contained in the more elaborate dishes of his brother, who is ignorant of the real meaning of food. A maxim of Hatha Yoga is, "It is not what a man eats, but the amount that he assimilates, that nourishes him." There is a world of wisdom in this old maxim, and it contains that which writers upon health subjects have taken volumes to express. We will show you later on the yogi method of extracting the maximum amount of nourishment from the minimum amount of food. The yogi method lies in the middle of the road, the two opposite sides of which road are traveled, respectively, by two differing Western schools, namely the food stuffers and starvationists, each of whom loudly proclaim the merits of their own cult and decry the claims of the opposing sect. The simple yogi may be pardoned for smiling good-naturedly at the disputes raging between those who, preaching the necessity of sufficient nutrition, teach that stuffing is necessary to obtain it, on the one hand, and at those of the opposing school who, recognizing the folly of stuffing and overeating, have no remedy to offer but a semi-starvation, accompanied with long continued fasts, which, of course, has brought many of its followers down to weakened bodies, impaired vitality, and even death. To the yogi, the evils of malnutrition on the one hand and overeating on the other do not exist. These questions have been settled for him centuries ago by the old yogi fathers, whose very names have been almost forgotten by their followers of today. Remember now, please, once and for all, that Hatha Yoga does not advocate the plan of starving oneself, but on the contrary, knows and teaches that no human body can be strong and healthy unless it is properly nourished by sufficient food eaten and assimilated. Many delicate, weak, and nervous people owe their impaired vitality and diseased condition to the fact that they do not obtain sufficient nourishment. Remember also that Hatha Yoga rejects as ridiculous the theory that nourishment is obtained from stuffing, gorging, or overeating, and views with wonder and pity these attributes of the glutton, and sees nothing in these practices but the manifestation of the attributes of the unclean swine, utterly unworthy of the developed man. To the yogi understanding, man should eat to live, not live to eat. The yogi is an epicure rather than a gourmand, for while eating the plainest food, he has cultivated and encouraged his natural and normal taste, so that his hunger imparts to these simple viands a relish sought after, but not obtained by those who hunt after rich and expensive triumphs of the chef. While eating for nourishment as his main object, he manages to make his food yield him a pleasure unknown to his brother, who scorns the simple fare. In our next chapter, we will take up the subject of hunger and appetite, two entirely different attributes of the physical body, although to most persons the two appear to mean almost the same thing. Chapter 9. Hunger versus appetite. As we said at the conclusion of the preceding chapter, hunger and appetite are two entirely different attributes of the human body. Hunger is the normal demand for food. Appetite, the abnormal craving. Hunger is like the rosy hue upon the cheek of the healthy child. Appetite is like the rouged face of the woman of fashion. And yet most people use the terms as if their meaning were identical. Let us see wherein lies the difference. It is quite difficult to explain the respective sensations or symptoms of hunger and appetite to the average person who has attained the age of maturity. For the majority of persons of that age have had their natural taste or hunger instinct perverted by appetite to such an extent that they have not experienced the sensation of genuine hunger for many years and have forgotten just what it felt like. And it is hard to describe a sensation unless one can call up in the mind of his hearer the recollection of the same, or a similar sensation experienced at some point in the past. We can describe a sound to the person of normal hearing by comparing it with something he has heard. But imagine the difficulty of conveying an intelligent idea of a sound to a man who was born stone deaf, or of describing a color to a man born blind, or of giving an intelligent description of an odor to one born without the sense of smell. To one who has emancipated himself from the thrall of appetite, the respective sensations of hunger and appetite are quite different, and readily distinguished one from the other, and the mind of such a one readily grasps the precise meaning of each term. But to the ordinary civilized man, hunger means the source of appetite, and appetite the result of hunger. Both words are misused. We must illustrate this by familiar examples. Let us take thirst, for instance. All of us know the sensation of a good natural thirst, which calls for a draught of cool water. It is felt in the mouth and throat, and can be satisfied only with that which nature intended for it, cool water. Now, this natural thirst is akin to natural hunger. How different is this natural thirst from the craving which one acquires for sweetened, flavored soda water, ice cream soda, ginger ale, pop, soft drinks, etc. And how different from the thirst which one feels for beer, alcoholic liquors, etc. after the taste has once been acquired. You begin to see what we mean? We hear people say that they are so thirsty for a glass of soda water, or others say that they are thirsty for a drink of whiskey. Now, if these people were really thirsty, or in other words, if nature was really calling for fluids, pure water would be just what they would seek first. And pure water would be just what they would first seek for. And pure water would be the thing which would best gratify the thirst. But no, water will not satisfy this soda water or whiskey thirst. Why? Simply because it is a craving of an appetite, which is not a natural thirst, but which is, on the contrary, an abnormal appetite, a perverted taste. The appetite has been created, the habit acquired, and it is asserting the mastery. You will notice that the victims of these abnormal thirsts will occasionally experience a real thirst, at which time water alone will be sought, and the tipple of the appetite not thought of. Just think a moment. Is not this so with you? This is not a lecture directed against the fancy drink habit or a temperance sermon, but just an illustration of the difference between a natural instinct and an acquired habit or appetite. Appetite is an acquired habit of eating or drinking and has but little to do with real hunger or thirst. A man acquires an appetite for tobacco in any of its forms, or for liquor, or for chewing gum, or for opium, morphine, cocaine, or similar drugs. And an appetite once acquired becomes, if anything, stronger than that natural demand for food or drink. For men have been known to die of starvation because they had spent all of their money for drinks or narcotics. Men have sold their babies' stockings for drink, have stolen and even murdered in order to gratify their appetite for narcotics. And yet, who would think of calling this terrible craving of appetite by the name hunger? And yet, we continue to speak of and think of every craving for something to put into the stomach as hunger, while many of these cravings are as much a symptom of appetite as is the craving or desire for alcohol or narcotics. The lower animal has a natural hunger until it is spoiled by contact with man or woman who tempts it with candies or similar articles miscalled food. The young child has a natural hunger until it is spoiled in the same way. In the child, natural hunger is more or less replaced by acquired appetites. the degree depending largely upon the amount of wealth its parents possess. The greater the wealth, the greater the accoutrement of false appetite. And as it grows older, it loses all recollection of what real hunger means. In fact, people speak of hunger as a distressing thing rather than as a natural instinct. Sometimes men go out camping in the open air, exercise, and natural life gives them again a taste of real hunger, and they eat like schoolboys and with a relish they have not known for years. They feel hungry and earnest and eat because they have to, not from mere habit, as they do when they are home and overloading their stomachs continually. We recently read of a party of wealthy people who were shipwrecked while on a yachting pleasure trip. They were compelled to live on the most meager fare for about 10 days. When rescued, they looked the picture of health, rosy, bright-eyed, and possessed of the precious gift of a good natural hunger. Some of the party had been dyspeptics for years, but the 10 days' experience with food scarce and at a premium had completely cured them of their dyspepsia and other troubles. They had obtained sufficient to properly nourish them and had gotten rid of the waste products of the system which had been poisoning them. Whether or not they stayed cured depended upon whether they again exchanged hunger for appetite. Natural hunger, like natural thirst, expresses itself through the nerves of the mouth and throat. When one is hungry, the thought or mention of food causes a peculiar sensation in the mouth, throat, and salivary glands. The nerves of those parts manifest a peculiar sensation. The saliva begins to flow, and the whole of the region manifests a desire to get to work. The stomach gives no symptoms whatever, and is not at all in evidence at such times. One feels that the taste of good, wholesome food would be most pleasurable. There is none of those feelings of faintness, emptiness, gnawing, all goneness, etc. in the region of the stomach. These last mentioned symptoms are all characteristic of the appetite habit, which is insisting that the habit must be continued. Do you ever notice that the drink habit calls forth just such symptoms? The craving and all-gone feeling is characteristic of both forms of abnormal appetite. The man who is craving a smoke or a chew of tobacco feels the same way. A man often wonders why he cannot get a dinner such as mother used to cook. Do you know why he cannot get it? Simply because he has replaced his natural hunger by an abnormal appetite, and he does not feel satisfied unless he gratifies that appetite, which renders the homely fare of the past an impossibility. If the man were to cultivate a natural hunger by a return to first principles, he would have restored to him the meals of his youth. He would find many cooks just as good as mother was, for he would be a boy again. You are probably wondering what all this has to do with Hatha Yoga, are you not? Well, just this. The yogi has conquered appetite and allows hunger to manifest through him. He enjoys every mouthful of food, even to the crust of dry bread, and obtains nourishment and pleasure from it. He eats it in a manner unknown to most of you, which will be described a little further on, and so far from being a half-starved anchorite, he is a well-fed, properly nourished enjoyer of the feast, for he has possessed himself of the most piquant of all sauces, hunger. Chapter 10. The Yogi Theory and practice of prana absorption from food. Nature's shrewdness in combining several duties into one, and also in rendering necessary duties pleasant and thereby likely to be performed, is illustrated in numberless ways. One of the most striking examples of this kind will be brought out in this chapter. We will see how she manages to accomplish several things at the same time, and how she also renders pleasant several most necessary offices of the physical system. Let us start with a statement of the yogi theory of the absorption of prana from food. This theory holds that there is contained in the food of man and the lower animals a certain form of prana, which is absolutely necessary for man's maintenance of strength and energy, and that such form of prana is absorbed from the food by the nerves of the tongue, mouth, and teeth. The act of mastication liberates this prana by separating the particles of the food into minute bits, thus exposing as many atoms of prana to the tongue, mouth, and teeth as possible. Each atom of food contains numerous electrons of food prana or food energy, which electrons are liberated by the breaking up process of mastication and the chemical action of certain subtle chemical constituents of the saliva, the presence of which have not been suspected by modern scientists and which are not discernible by the tests of modern chemistry, although future investigators will scientifically prove their existence. Once liberated from the food, this food prana flies to the nerves of the tongue, mouth, and teeth, passing through the flesh and bone readily, and is rapidly conveyed to numerous storage houses of the nervous system, from whence it is conveyed to all parts of the body, where it is used to furnish energy and vitality to the cells. This is a bare statement of the theory, the details of which we will endeavor to fill in as we proceed. The student will probably wonder why it is necessary to extract this food prana, as the air is heavily charged with prana, and it may seem like a waste of effort on the part of nature to use such food, to use so much energy in order to extract the prana from the food. But here is the explanation. Just as all electricity is electricity, so is all prana simply prana. But just as there are several forms of the electric current manifesting widely different effects upon the human body, so are there several manifestations or forms of prana, each of which performs certain work in the physical body, and all of which are needed for the different kinds of work. The prana of the air fulfills certain offices, that of the water others, and that derived from the food still a third set of duties. To go into the minute details of the yogi theory would be foreign to the purposes of this work, and we must rest content with the general statements here given. The main subject before us is the fact that the food contains food prana, which the human body needs, and which it can extract only in the manner above stated, for example by mastication of the food and the absorption of the prana by the nervous system by means of the nerves of the tongue, mouth, and teeth. Now let us consider nature's plan in combining two important offices in the act of masticating and in salivating. In the first place, nature intended every particle of food to be thoroughly masticated and insalivated before it was swallowed, and any neglect in this respect is sure to be followed by imperfect digestion. Thorough mastication is a natural habit of man which has been neglected owing to the demands of artificial habits of living which have grown up around our civilization. Mastication is necessary to break up the food that it may be more easily swallowed, and also that it may be mixed with the saliva and the digestive juices of the stomach and small intestines. It promotes the flow of saliva, which is the most necessary part of the process of digestion. Insalivation of food is part of the digestive process, and certainly work is done by the saliva, which cannot be performed by the other digestive juices. Physiologists teach most positively that thorough mastication and proper insalivation of the food are prerequisites of normal digestion and form a most necessary part of the process. Certain specialists have gone much further and have given to the process of mastication and insalivation much more importance than have the general run of physiologists. One particular authority, Mr. Horace Fletcher, an American writer, has written most forcibly upon this subject and has given startling proofs of the importance of this function and process of the physical body. In fact, Mr. Fletcher advises a particular form of mastication which corresponds very closely to the yogi custom, although he advises it because of its wonderful effect upon the digestion, whereas the yogis practice a similar system upon the theory of the absorption of food prana. The truth is that both results are accomplished, it being a part of nature's strategy that the grinding of the food into small bits, the digestive process attending the insalivation, and the absorption of food prana are accomplished at the same time, an economy of force most remarkable. In the natural state of man, mastication was a most pleasant process, and so it is in the case of the lower animals and the children of the human race today. The animal chews and munches his food with the greatest relish, and the child sucks, chews, and holds in the mouth the food much longer than does the adult, until it begins to take lessons from its parents and acquires the custom of bolting its food. Mr. Fletcher, in his books on the subject, takes the position that it is taste which affords the pleasure of this chewing and sucking process. The yogi theory is that while taste has much to do with it, still there is a something else, an indescribable sense of satisfaction obtained from holding the food in the mouth, rolling it around with the tongue, masticating it, and allowing it to dissolve slowly and be swallowed almost unconsciously. Fletcher holds that while there remains a particle of taste in the food, nourishment is there to be extracted, and we believe this to be strictly correct. But we hold that there is that other sensation which, when allowed to manifest itself, gives us a certain satisfaction in the non-swallowing, and which sensation continues until all, or nearly all, the food prana is extracted from the food. You will notice if you follow the yogi plan of eating, even partially, that you will be loath to part with the food, and that, instead of bolting it at once, you will allow it to gradually melt away in the mouth until suddenly you realize that it is all gone. And this sensation is experienced from the plainest kinds of food, which do not appeal particularly to the taste, as well as to those foods which are special favorites of your particular taste. To describe this sensation is almost impossible, for we have no English words coined for it, as its existence has not been fully recognized by the Western races. The best we can do is to compare it by other sensations at the risk of being accused of presenting a ridiculous comparison or illustration. Here is what we mean. You know the sensation which one sometimes feels when, in the presence of a highly magnetic person, that indescribable feeling of the absorption of strength or vitality. Some people have so much prana in their system that they are continually running over and giving it out to others. The result being that other persons like to be in their company and dislike to leave it, being almost unable to tear themselves away. This is one instance. Another is the sensation which one obtains from being close to another whom one loves. In this case, there is an interchange of magnetism, thought charged with prana, which is quite exhilarating. A kiss from the loved one is so filled with magnetism that it thrills one from head to toe. This gives an imperfect illustration of what we are trying to describe. The pleasure that one obtains from proper and normal eating is not alone a matter of taste, but is largely derived from the peculiar sensation of the absorption of magnetism or prana, which is very much akin to the examples above mentioned, although until one realizes the similar character of the two manifestations of energy, the illustration may evoke a smile or possibly ridicule. When one has overcome the false appetite, so often mistaken for hunger, he will masticate a dry crust of whole wheat bread and not only obtain a certain satisfaction of taste from the nourishment contained within it, but will enjoy the sensation of which we have spoken very keenly. It takes a little practice in order to get rid of the false appetite habit and to return to nature's plans. The most nourishing of foods will yield the most satisfaction to the normal taste, and it is a fact to be remembered that food prana is contained in food in direct proportion to its percentage of nourishment. Another instance of nature's wisdom. The yogi eats his food slowly, masticating each mouthful so long as he feels like it. That is, so long as it yields him any satisfaction. In the majority of cases, this sensation lasts so long as there remains any food in the mouth, as nature's involuntary processes gradually causes the food to be slowly dissolved and swallowed. The yogi moves his jaws slowly and allows the tongue to caress the food and the teeth to sink into it lovingly, knowing that he is extracting the food prana from it by means of the nerves of the mouth, tongue, and teeth, and that he is being stimulated and strengthened, and that he is replenishing his reservoir of energy. At the same time, he is conscious that he is preparing his food in the proper way for the digestive processes of the stomach and small intestines, and is giving his body good material needed for the building up of the physical body. Those who follow the yogi plan of eating will obtain a far greater amount of nourishment from their food than does the ordinary person. For every ounce is forced to yield up the maximum nourishment, while in the case of the man who bolts his food half masticated and insufficiently insalivated, much goes to waste and is passed from the system in the shape of a decaying, fermenting mass. Under the yogi plan, nothing is passed from the system as waste except the real waste matter, every particle of nourishment being extracted from the food, and the greater portion of the food prana being absorbed from its atoms. The mastication breaks up the food into small particles, allowing the fluids of the saliva to interpenetrate it, the digestive juices of the saliva performing their necessary work, and the other juices mentioned above acting upon the atoms of the food in such a way as to liberate the food prana, thus allowing it to be taken up by the nervous system. The motion imparted to the food by the action of the jaws, tongue, and cheeks in the act of mastication cause it to present new atoms to the nerves ready to extract the food prana. The yogis hold the food in the mouth, masticating it slowly and thoroughly, and allowing it to be slowly swallowed by the involuntary process above alluded to, and they experience to the full the enjoyment attendant upon the extraction of prana. You may get an idea of this by taking into the mouth some particle of food when you have plenty of time for the experiment, and then slowly masticating it, allowing it to gradually melt away in the mouth as you would a lump of sugar. You will be surprised to find how thoroughly this work of involuntary swallowing is performed. The food gradually yields up its food prana and then melts slowly away and reaches the stomach. Take a crust of bread, for example, and masticate it thoroughly, with the idea of seeing how long it will last without being swallowed. You will find that it will never be swallowed in the usual way, but will gradually disappear in the manner we have just mentioned, after being reduced to a pasty, creamy mass by degrees. And that little mouthful of bread will have yielded you about twice as much nourishment as a piece of equal size, eaten in the ordinary way, and about 3 times the amount of food prana. Another interesting example is had in the case of milk. Milk is a fluid and, of course, needs no breaking up, as does solid food. Yet the fact remains, and is well established by careful experiments, that a quart of milk simply allowed to flow down the throat yields not over half the nourishment or food prana that is derived from the same quantity of milk sipped slowly and allowed to remain in the mouth a moment until it melts away, the tongue being moved through it. The babe drawing the milk from the nipple of either the breast or the bottle, of course, does so by sucking motion, which moves the tongue and cheeks and produces a flow of fluid from the glands, which liberates the food prana and has a chemical digestive effect upon the milk itself, notwithstanding the fact that true saliva is not secreted in the young babe and does not appear until the teeth show themselves. We advise our students to experiment with themselves along the lines just pointed out. Choose an opportunity when you have plenty of time, then masticating slowly, allow the food to gradually melt away instead of making a deliberate attempt to swallow. This melting away of the food can only be possible when the food is masticated into a cream-like paste, thoroughly saturated with saliva and the particles thereby converted into a semi-digested state. And having had the food prana extracted therefrom, try eating an apple in this way, and you will be surprised at the feeling of having eaten a fair-sized meal, and at the sensation of increased strength which has come to you. We understand fully that it is quite a different thing for the yogi to take his time and eat in this way, and for the hurried Western man of business to do the same. And we do not expect all of our readers to change the habit of years all at once. But we feel sure that a little practice in this method of eating food will cause quite a change to come over one. And we know that such occasional practice will soon result in quite an improvement in the everyday method of masticating the food. We know also that the student will find a new delight, an additional relish in eating, and will soon learn to eat lovingly, that is, to feel loath to let the mouthful of food pass away. A new world of taste is opened up to the man who learns to follow this plan, and he will get far more pleasures from eating than ever before, and will have, besides, a much better digestion and much more vitality, for he will obtain a greater degree of nourishment and an increased amount of food prana. It is possible for one who has the time and opportunity to follow this plan to its extreme limit to obtain an almost unbelievable amount of nourishment and strength from a comparatively small amount of food, as there will be practically no waste, as may be proven by an observation of the waste matter which is passed from the system. Those suffering from malnutrition and impaired vitality will find it profitable to at least partially follow this plan. The yogis are known as small eaters, and yet they understand fully the necessity and value of perfect nutrition, and always keep the body well nourished and provided with building material. The secret, as you will readily see, is that they waste practically none of the nourishment in the food, as they extract practically all that it contains. They do not burden their system with waste material, which clogs up the machinery and causes a waste of energy in order that it may be thrown off. They obtain a maximum of nourishment from a minimum of food, a full supply of food prana from a small amount of material. While you may not be able to follow this matter up to the extreme, you may work a great improvement in yourself by following the methods given above. We merely give you the general principles. Work the rest out for yourself. Experiment for yourself. That is the only way to learn anything, anyway. We have stated several times in this book that the mental attitude aids materially in the process of absorbing prana. This is true not only of the prana absorbed from the air, but also of the food prana. Hold the thought that you are absorbing all the prana contained in a mouthful of food, combining that thought with that of nourishment, and you will be able to do much more than you can without so doing. Chapter 11. About food. We intend to leave the matter of the choice of food an open question with our students. While, personally, we prefer certain kinds of food, believing that the best results are obtained from the use thereof, we recognize the fact that it is impossible to change the habits of a lifetime, yes, of many generations, in a day, and man must be guided by his own experience and his growing knowledge, rather than by dogmatic utterance of others. The yogis prefer a non-animal diet, both from hygienic reasons and the oriental aversion to eating the flesh of animals. The more advanced of the yogi students prefer a diet of fruits, nuts, olive oil, etc., together with a form of unleavened bread made from the entire wheat. But when they travel among those who follow different dietary rules from themselves, they do not hesitate to adapt themselves to the changed conditions to a greater or lesser extent, and do not render themselves a burden to their hosts, knowing that if they follow the yogi plan of masticating their food slowly, their stomachs will take good care of what they eat. In fact, some of the most indigestible things in the modern menu may be safely eaten if the above-mentioned system is adopted. And while we write this chapter in the spirit of the traveling yogi, we have no wish to force arbitrary rules upon our students. Man must grow into a more rational method of eating, rather than have it forced upon him suddenly. It is hard for one to adopt a non-meat diet if he has been used to animal flesh all his life, and it is equally difficult for one to take up an uncooked dietary list if he has been eating cooked dishes all his life. All we ask of you is to think a little on the subject and to trust your own instinct regarding the choice of food, giving yourself as great a variety as possible. The instinct, if trusted, will usually cause you to select that which you need for that particular meal, and we would prefer to trust the instinct rather than to bind ourselves to any fixed, unchangeable dietary. Eat pretty much what you feel like, providing you masticate it thoroughly and slowly, and give yourself a wide range of choice. We will speak in this chapter of a few things which the rational man will avoid, but will do so merely in the way of general advice. In the matter of non-meat eating, we believe that mankind will gradually grow to feel that meat is not its proper diet, but we believe that one must outgrow that feeling rather than to have it beaten out of him. For if he longs for the flesh pots of Egypt, it is about as bad as if he really participated in the feast. Man will cease to desire meat as he grows, but until that time comes, any forced restraint of the meat habit will not do him good. We are aware that this will be considered heterodox by many of our readers, but we cannot help that fact. Our statements will stand the test of experience. If our students are interested in the question of the relative advantages of particular kinds of foods, let them read some of the very good works which have been written upon the subject of recent years. But let them read upon the several sides of the question, and avoid being carried away by the particular fad of the writer whose book is before them. It is instructive and interesting to read of the comparative food values of the various articles upon our tables, and such knowledge will gradually tend to a more rational dietary. But such changes must be the result of thought and experience, rather than upon the mere say-so of some person writing a hobby. We suggest that our students consider whether or not they are eating too much meat, whether they are living upon too much fat and grease, whether they are eating enough fruit, whether whole wheat bread would not be a good addition to their bill of fare, whether they are not indulging in too much pastry and made dishes. If we were asked to give them a general rule regarding eating, we would be apt to say, eating a variety of foods, avoid rich dishes, do not eat too much fat, beware of the frying pan, do not eat too much meat, avoid especially pig meat and veal. Let your general habit of eating tend towards the simple, plain fare, rather than towards the elaborate dishes. Go slowly on pastry. Cut out hot cakes from your list. Masticate thoroughly and slowly according to the plan we have given you. Don't be afraid of food. If you eat it properly, it will not hurt you, providing you do not fear it. We think it better to make the first meal of the day a light one, as there is very little waste to repair in the morning, as the body has been at rest all night. If possible, take a little exercise before breakfast. If you once return to the natural habit of proper mastication and experience the sensation that comes from proper eating, the abnormal appetites which have been acquired will fall from you, and natural hunger will return. When natural hunger is with you, the instinct will be very keen in picking out nutritious food for you, and you will feel inclined toward that which will give you just the nourishment you need at any particular time. Man's instinct is a good guide, providing it has not been spoiled by the indulgence in the absurd dishes so common in these days, which create false appetite. If you feel out of sorts, do not be afraid to cut out a meal and give the stomach a chance to get rid of what it has on hand. One can go without eating for a number of days without danger, although we do not advise prolonged fasts. We feel, however, that in sickness it is wise to give the stomach a rest in order that the recuperative energy may be directed towards the casting out of the waste matter which has been causing the trouble. You will notice that the animals stop eating while they are sick and lie around until health is restored, when they return to their meals. We may take this lesson from them with considerable profit. We do not wish students to become food cranks who weigh, measure, and analyze every mouthful of food. We consider this an abnormal method and believe that such a course generates fear, thought, and fills the instinctive mind with all sorts of erroneous ideas. We think it a much better plan to use ordinary precautions and judgment in the selection of one's food, and then to bother no more about the matter, but eat with the thought of nourishment and strength in your minds, masticating the food as we have stated, and knowing that nature will do its work well. Keep as close to nature as possible, and let her plans be your standard of measurement. The strong, healthy man is not afraid of his food, and neither should be the man who wishes to be healthy. Keep cheerful, breathe properly, eat properly, live properly, and you will not have occasion to make a chemical analysis of every mouthful of food. Do not be afraid to trust to your instinct, for that is the natural man's guide, after all. Chapter 12. The irrigation of the body. One of the cardinal principles of the Hatha Yoga philosophy of health is the intelligent use of nature's great gift to living things, water. It should not be necessary to even call the attention of men to the fact that water is one of the great means of maintaining normal health. But man has become so much a slave to artificial environments, habits, customs, etc., that he has forgotten nature's laws. His only hope is to return to nature. The little child knows instinctively the use of water and insists upon being furnished with it. But as it grows older, it gets away from the natural habit and falls into the erroneous practices of the older people around it. This is particularly true of those living in large cities, where they find unpalatable the warm water drawn from faucets, and so gradually become weaned away from the normal use of fluids. Such persons gradually form new habits of drinking and not drinking, and putting off nature's demands, they at last are not conscious of them. We often hear people say, "But why should we drink water? We do not get thirsty." But had they continued in nature's paths, they would get thirsty. And the only reason why they do not hear nature's calls is because they have so long turned a deaf ear to her that she has become discouraged and cries less loudly, because their ears have ceased to recognize the vibrations, being so much taken up with other things. It is astonishing to find how people neglect this important feature of life. Many drink scarcely any fluids, and even say that they do not think it is good for them. This has gone so far that we know of one so-called health teacher who puts forth the astounding theory that thirst is a disease and counsels people against the use of fluids at all, stating that the use of them is unnatural. We will not attempt to argue with these teachings. Their folly must be apparent to anyone who will look at the natural life habits of man and the lower animals. Let man go back to nature, and he will see water drinking all around him in all forms of life, from the plant up to the highest mammal. So much importance does the yogi attach to the proper use of drinking water that he considers it one of the first principles of health. He knows that a large percentage of sick people are sick because of their lack of the fluids which their body requires. Just as the plant needs water, as well as the food derived from the soil and air, to bring it to healthy maturity, so does man require the proper amounts of fluids to keep him in health, or to bring him again to health in case he has lost it. Who would think of depriving a plant of water? And who would be so cruel as to fail to provide the faithful horse with the requisite amount of water? And yet man, while giving the plant and the animal that which his common sense teaches him they require, will deprive himself of the life-giving fluid, and will suffer the consequences, just as would the plant and horse under similar conditions. Keep this example of plant and horse before you when you consider the question of drinking water. Let us see what water is used for in the body, and then make up our minds whether or not we have been living normal lives in this respect. In the first place, about 70% of our physical body is water. A certain amount of this water is being used up by our system and leaves the body constantly, and every ounce that is used up must be replaced by another ounce if the body is to be kept in a normal condition. The system is continuously excreting water through the pores of the skin in the shape of sweat and perspiration. Sweat is the term applied to such excretion when it is thrown off so rapidly that it gathers and collects in drops. Perspiration is the term applied when the water is continuously and unconsciously evaporated from the skin. Perspiration is continuously being evaporated from the skin, and experiments have shown that when it is prevented, the animal dies. In one of the festivals of ancient Rome, a boy was covered with gold leaf from head to foot in order to represent one of the gods. He died before the gold leaf could be removed, the perspiration being unable to penetrate the varnish and the leaf. Nature's function was interrupted, and the body being unable to function properly, the soul threw off its fleshly tenement. Sweat and perspiration are shown by chemical analysis to be loaded with the waste products of the system, the refuse and filth of the body, which, without a sufficient supply of fluids in the system, would remain in the body, poisoning it and bringing disease and death as a consequence. The repair work of the body is continually going on, the used up and worn out tissue being carried off and replaced by fresh, new material from the blood, which has absorbed it from the nutrition in the food. This waste must be cast out of the body, and nature is quite particular in that shall be gotten rid of. She does not favor the storing up of garbage in the system. If this waste matter is allowed to remain in the system, it becomes a poison and breeds diseased conditions. It serves as a breeding place and a feeding ground for germs, microbes, spores, and bacteria, and all the rest of that family. Germs do not bother the clean and healthy system to any great extent. But let them come around one of these water haters, and it finds his or her body full of uncast off refuse and filth, and they settle down to business. We will have something more to say along this line when we come to the subject of bathing. Water plays a most important part in the everyday life of the Hatha Yoga. He uses it internally and externally. He uses it to keep healthy, and he teaches its value to bring about healthy conditions. Where disease has impaired the natural functioning of the body, we will touch upon the use of water in several parts of this book. We wish to impress upon our students the importance of the subject, begging them not to pass it by as unimportant, because it is so simple. 7 out of 10 of our readers need this advice. Do not pass it by. This means you. Both perspiration and sweat are necessary also to dissipate the excessive bodily heat by their evaporation, and thus keep down the bodily temperature to a normal degree. The perspiration and sweat also, as we have stated, assist in carrying off the waste products of the system, the skin being, in fact, a supplementary organ to the kidneys. And without water, the skin would, of course, be unable to perform this function. The normal adult excretes about 1 1/2 to 2 pints of water in 24 hours in the shape of sweat and perspiration. But men working in rolling mills, etc., excrete much greater quantities. One can endure a much greater degree of heat in a dry atmosphere than in a moist one, because in the former, the perspiration is evaporated so rapidly that the heat is more readily and rapidly dissipated. Quite a quantity of water is exhaled through the lungs. The urinary organs pass off a large quantity in performing their functions, about 3 pints in 24 hours being the amount voided by the normal adult. And all this has to be replenished in order to keep the physical machinery going right. Water is needed by the system for a number of purposes. One of its purposes, as above stated, is to counteract and regulate the combustion constantly going on in our bodies, arising from the chemical action of the oxygen extracted by the lungs from the air, coming in contact with the carbon arising from the food. This combustion going on in millions of cells produces the animal heat. The water passing through the system regulates this combustion so that it does not become too intense. Water is also used by the body as a common carrier. It flows through the arteries and veins and conveys the blood, corpuscles, and elements of nutrition to the various parts of the body that they may be used in the building up process, which we have described. Without fluids in the system, the quantity of blood must decrease. On the return trip of the blood through the veins, the fluids take up the waste matter, much of which would be a rank poison if allowed to remain in the system, and carries it to the excretory organism of the kidneys, the pores of the skin, and lungs, where the poisonous dead material and waste of the system is thrown off. Without sufficient fluids, this work cannot be accomplished as nature intended. And, this a most important matter, without sufficient water, the waste portions of the food, the ashes of the system, cannot be kept sufficiently moist to easily pass through the colon and out of the body, and constipation with all of its attendant evils result. The yogis know that 9/10 of the cases of chronic constipation arise from this cause, They also know that 9/10 of the cases of chronic constipation may be speedily cured by the returning of the natural habit of drinking water. We will devote a special chapter to this subject, but we wish to direct the attention of the reader to its importance as often as possible. Yes, a sufficient supply of water is needed to aid in the proper stimulation and circulation of the blood, in the elimination of the waste products of the system, and in the normal assimilation of nourishment by the system. Persons who do not drink sufficient fluids almost invariably are deficient in their supply of blood. They are often bloodless-looking creatures, pale, sallow, bloodless-looking anemic creatures. Their skin is often dry and feverish, and they perspire but little. They have an unhealthy appearance and remind one of dried fruit, needing a good soaking to make them look plump and normal. They are nearly always sufferers from constipation, and constipation brings with it a myriad of other disorders, as we will show you in another chapter. Their large intestines or colon are unclean, and the system is continually absorbing the products of the waste stored away and endeavoring to get rid of it by means of foul breath, strong, sweaty perspiration, and unnatural urine. This is not pleasant reading, but it is necessary to use plain words when calling your attention to these things. And all this for the lack of a little water. Just think of it. You who are so particular to keep yourselves clean on the outside, allow yourselves to remain filthy within. Man's body needs water all over its inner parts. It needs constant irrigation. And if that irrigation is denied, the bodies suffer just as does the land, denied its natural supply of water. Every cell, tissue, and organ needs water in order to be healthy. Water is a universal solvent and enables the system to assimilate and distribute the nourishment obtained from the food and to get rid of the waste products of the system. It is often said that the blood is the life, and if this is so, what must the water be called? For without water, the blood would be but dust. Water is needed also for the purpose of enabling the kidneys to perform their functions of carrying off the urea. It is needed in order to be manufactured into saliva, bile, pancreatic juice, gastric juices, and all the other valuable juices of the system, without which digestion would be impossible. Shut off your supply of fluids, and you decrease your supply of all of these necessary things. Do you realize that? If you doubt these facts, thinking them to be but theories of the yogis, you have but to refer to any good scientific work upon physiology written by any of the Western authorities upon the subject. You will find all that we have told you fully corroborated there. A well-known Western physiologist has said that so much water exists in the tissues of a normal system that it may be asserted as an axiom that all organisms live in water, and if there is no water, there can be no life or health. You have been shown that the kidneys secrete about 3 pints of urine in 24 hours, which is passed off from the system, carrying in solution waste products and poisonous chemical substances which have been gathered up from the system by the kidneys. In addition to this, we have shown you that the skin excretes from 1 1/2 pints to 2 pints of water in the shape of sweat and perspiration in the same time. In addition to this, there is a moderate quantity, average 10 to 15 ounces, given off by the lungs in exhalation during the same time. Besides, a certain amount passes off through the excretions from the bowels, and a small amount is passed from the system in the shape of tears and other secretions and excretions from the body. Now, how much water is needed to renew this waste? Let us see. A certain amount of fluids is taken into the system with the food, particularly when certain kinds of food are eaten. But this is only a comparatively small portion of what has been thrown off from the system in its cleansing functions. The best authorities agree that from 2 quarts to 5 pints of water is the amount necessary to be taken daily by the average normal man and woman in order to make up that waste. If that amount is not supplied to the body, it will withdraw fluids from the system until the person assumes that dried up state of which we have spoken, with the consequence that all the physical functions are impaired, the person being dried up inside as well as on the surface, the machinery of the body being deprived of its lubricating and cleansing material. 2 quarts a day. Just think of that, you people who have been taking about 1 pint or even less each day. Do you wonder why you are afflicted with all sorts of bodily ailments? No wonder you are dyspeptic, constipated, bloodless, nervous, and generally all out of sorts. Your bodies are filled with all sorts of poisonous substances which nature has not been able to eliminate and throw off through the kidneys and skin because you have shut off her water supply. No wonder your colons are filled with impacted waste matter, which is poisoning your system and which nature has been unable to pass off in the regular way because you did not give her water with which to flush her sewers. No wonder that your saliva and gastric juices are deficient. How do you suppose nature can manufacture them without sufficient water? No wonder your blood is deficient in quantity. Where do you suppose nature is going to get the fluids from to make the blood? No wonder that your nerves are out of condition with all this abnormal going on. Poor nature does the best she can, even though you be foolish. She draws a little water from the system in order that the machinery shall not entirely stop, but she dare not draw too much, so she compromises. She doesn't just as you do when the water in the spring is nearly exhausted. You try to make a little do the work of much, and much rest content with doing things only halfway right. The yogis are not afraid to drink a sufficient amount of water each day. They are not afraid of thinning the blood, as are some of these dried up people. Nature throws off the surplus quantity if taken very readily and rapidly. They do not crave ice water, an unnatural product of civilization. Their favorite temperature is about 60 degrees. They drink when they are thirsty, and they have a normal thirst which does not have to be restored as does that of the dried up people. They drink frequently, but mark ye this, they do not drink large quantities at any one time. They do not pour the water down, believing that such a practice is abnormal and unnatural and injurious. They drink it in small quantities throughout the day. When working, they often keep a vessel of water near them and frequently sip therefrom. Those who have neglected their natural instincts for many years have almost forgotten the natural habit of drinking water and need considerable practice to regain it. A little practice will soon begin to create a demand for water, and you will in time regain the natural thirst. A good plan is to keep a glass of water near you and take an occasional sip from it, thinking at the same time what you are taking it for. Say to yourself, I am giving my body the fluids it requires to do its work properly, and it will respond by bringing normal conditions back to me, giving me good health and strength, and making me a strong, healthy, natural man or woman. The yogis drink a cupful of water the last thing before going to bed at night. This is taken up by the system and is used in cleansing the body during the night, the waste products being excreted with the urine in the morning. They also drink a cupful immediately after arising in the morning. The theory being that by taking the water before eating it cleanses the stomach and washes away the sediment and waste which has settled during the night. They usually drink a cupful about an hour before each meal, following it by some mild exercise, believing that this prepares the digestive apparatus for the meal and promotes natural hunger. They are not afraid of drinking a little water even at meals. Imagine the horror of some of our health teachers when they read this, but are careful not to wash down their food with water. Washing down the food with water not only dilutes the saliva, but causes one to swallow his food imperfectly insalivated and masticated, makes it go down before nature is ready, and interferes with the yogi method of masticating the food. The yogis believe that only in this way is water harmful when taken at meals, and for the reason given alone, they take a little at each meal to soften up the food mass in the stomach, and that little does not weaken the stomach of the gastric juices. Many of our readers are familiar with the use of hot water as a means of cleansing a foul stomach. We approve of its use in that way when needed, but we think that if our students will carefully follow the yogi plan of living as given in this book, they will have no foul stomachs needing cleansing. Their stomachs will be good, healthy ones. As a preliminary towards rational eating, the sufferer may find it advantageous to use hot water in this way. The best way is to take about 1 pint, slowly sipping it in the morning before breakfast, or about 1 hour before other meals. It will excite a muscular action in the digestive organs, which will tend to pass from the system the foul matter stored up there, which the hot water has loosened up and diluted as well. But this is only a temporary expedient. Nature did not contemplate hot water as steady beverage, and water at ordinary temperature is all that she requires in health, and that she requires to maintain health. But when health has been lost through disobedience to her laws, hot water is a good thing with which to clean house before resuming natural habits. We will have more to say about the use of water in bathing, outward application, etc. in other parts of this book. This chapter is devoted to its internal offices. In addition to the properties, offices, and uses of water as given above, we will add that water contains prana in considerable quantities, a portion of which it parts with in the system, particularly if the system demands it and extracts it. One often feels the need of a cupful of water as a stimulant, the reason being that for some reason the normal supply of prana has become depleted, and nature, recognizing that it may obtain prana rapidly and easily from water, causes the demand. You all remember how at times a cup of cool water has acted as a powerful stimulant and refresher to you, and how it enabled you to return to your work with renewed vigor and energy. Do not forget water when you feel used up. Used in connection with yogi breathing, it will give a man fresh energy quicker than will any other method. In sipping water, let it remain in the mouth a moment before swallowing. The nerves of the tongue and mouth are the first and quickest to absorb the prana, and this plan will prove advantageous, particularly when one is tired. This is worth remembering.